Well, it's so great to have everyone here tonight. Thank you for giving us your time. If you've read any of Zach's blogs, you'll know it is well worth your time this evening, as it's going to be a great hour of learning. And we're going to be talking about mistakes. So Zach, I'm going to hand it over to you to kick things off for us. And I just wanted to quickly introduce myself. I'm Claire, and Lisa is also joining us tonight. And if there are questions that come up, if you're having any technical difficulties, you'll see us responding in the chat during the webinar. So just wanted to make sure you knew who we were. I'm going to actually change my name so you can see I'm from SAP, from Student Achievement Partners. But otherwise, I want to hand it over to Zach to get us going.
Great. Thanks so much, Claire. Hey, everybody. So for those of us who are working in schools, right, we kind of find ourselves in that liminal state right now between February and spring breaks, which is the most hectic time of year. And I seem to forget that every year. So I just want to start by thanking you all for carving out a bit of time from your busy weekday schedule to spend with me as we learn about how we can cultivate a learning environment in our classrooms and schools that equip students with the will, skill, and thrill to learn from their mistakes. I'm Zach Cohen, the middle school director at St. Francis here in Louisville, Kentucky, a non-sectarian progressive independent school. I'm also a consultant and blogger for the Core Collaborative, Student Achievement Partners, and School Rubric. And if you'd like to connect with me or follow me, I can be reached at my Twitter handle, email address, or via my website. Now, before we set the course for the evening, let's just quickly review a couple of important housekeeping items. First, we are recording this session, and you'll be able to find the recording on Achieve the Core, along with the presentation materials, of which there are a few. Second, you can receive professional credit for attending tonight's webinar. Simply fill out the survey at the end of the webinar, and confirmation will be sent to you. And finally, we want to be sure that we're engaging with one another and the content of the presentation in an intellectually curious and respectful manner. And obviously, these agreements are vital to create in a brave space, irrespective of the content of a presentation. But I also think that they are especially apropos for us to collectively navigate the content of this evening's presentation. Right, as the age-old and unattributable, it's in the schools. So it should be no surprise that study after study after study has found that school culture in the United States is heavily informed by white middle-class values. Now, those of us who share these identity markers would have possessed some sense of belonging in that learning environment that was not necessarily shared by our peers from marginalized groups who may have perceived their learning environment to be exclusionary. Now, the absence of this ingrained sense of belonging has been proven to disrupt cognitive processing, reduce risk tolerance, and foreground a fear of stereotype threat. And to make and learn from our mistakes, we need to be daring, we need to be bold, but we can only really be as daring and bold as our own privilege allows, right? As one of my study participants shared, there's a willingness on the part of our white male students to be able to just sort of blurt out answers and be kind of wrong, no fear whatsoever. And so there's this comfort that comes from them feeling that sense of safety. There are no negative consequences beyond the moment. There's nothing that sparks structural wounds in them. And so when they make mistakes, it's easier for them to recover. It doesn't leave them in a position of ill repute. And this is a mindset that we don't teach to girls and to people of color. Equitable access to learning is predicated on equitable access to mistake making, but such access can be limited by that pernicious and pervasive presence of cultural stereotypes and structural legacies in schools. The social power that students possess is a relative but fundamental reality, and it serves as an important explanatory condition to illuminate the extent to which students are willing to make and learn from their mistakes. Of course, demography is not destiny, and it does not define what students are capable of. And yet, demography does factor into our relationship with mistakes. It's important that we acknowledge this tonight. For some of us, it's possible that tonight's learning will be emotionally fraught and trigger that kind of shame core that may have been provoked and activated when we were adolescents. So to circle approach this evening's learning with an empathetic, inquiry mindset that seeks to validate and affirm each participant's lived experience, even if that experience deviates from our own. And with that, let's go ahead and check out our agenda for the evening. So over this next hour, we're going to explore what the research tells us about how to optimize learning from mistakes and how to apply this research to suit our individual school contexts. We're going to open with some direct instruction about the what, why, and how of mistake learning. Next, we'll break into small groups to share our learning and answer the so what, here's what, and now what of mistake literacy. And finally, we'll regroup and share out. But before we get into the meat and potatoes of today's presentation, let's take a minute to explicate our personal interactions with and relationship to mistakes, both in an applied and theoretical sense. So Claire, if you want to go ahead and pop that first Zoom poll, very nice. So go ahead and just think back to when you were a student. Did you ever make a mistake that you learned from? And obviously this feels a little bit like a softball. I'm going to go ahead because I know that I made plenty of mistakes that I've learned from. I think back to my freshman year of college. I went to a K-12 school that didn't actually have grades, progressive independent school. And so the first grade I ever received was in my intro to psychology course, my freshman year of college. And I got back that first test and I earned a 65. I went back to my quad and I began to boast about this 65 that I had earned because I had believed that the threshold for success and achievement, according to a grading scale, was anything above 50% was an A. Turns out I was wrong. And I very quickly, my now being on preliminary academic probation, had to learn about the grading scale. So that for me would have been one of those instances where I learned from my mistakes. And I certainly made plenty of them. And it looks like, based on the experiences, hopefully less embarrassing than mine, but nonetheless experiences, right? 66% of us made plenty of mistakes that you learn from, 26% some mistakes that you learn from, and 8% plenty of mistakes, but I didn't learn from many of them. And we're going to talk a lot about that 26% and that 8% tonight. And we're also really going to try to find ways to optimize and almost guarantee that 66%. And let's go ahead to question number 2. So think back again to when you were a student. Did you ever make a mistake that you didn't learn from? And I'm going to say more than I care to admit. And, you know, for me, I think back to 8th grade chemistry. And I think back to learning Lewis structures, if anybody remembers Lewis structures. I remember taking an assessment. I made countless mistakes. And I remember those mistakes like rising to a level of consciousness. And then I ultimately just chose to dismiss them. I remember crumpling up the test and literally throwing it in my backpack. I didn't seek to reconcile that disequilibrium that results from that disconnect between our knowing and our not yet knowing. And we'll get into this a little bit more later, but in large part, this can be attributed to this being a one-off assessment on a topic that we would never revisit again, right? I never learned Lewis structures again. And because I had no innate drive to become a chemist, I figured I wouldn't use it again. And so I summarily dismissed the opportunity for learning. And I'm curious to see these poll results if they pop up. Yeah, so again, a lot of us kind of in that range of more than we care to admit. Don't worry, we're going to preserve your anonymity tonight. We're not going to put anybody on the spot. And then, yes, but I learned from most of my mistakes was definitely a few. And some of us, not to brag, but nonetheless learned from most of our mistakes. Congratulations to those few of us. And question 3, think back to when you were a student. What accounted for the one you didn't? And we have the conditions at home or in school maybe didn't allow for it, right? I guess I just wasn't motivated to learn from it. That's kind of what I spoke to in that last example, right? Maybe I just didn't possess the skills I needed to learn from it. And that's really going to kind of be the crux of tonight's learning. And then sometimes it's just easier to ignore a mistake, right? So let's go ahead. I'm going to go ahead and say, I guess I just wasn't motivated to learn from it. That's certainly mine. I'll be curious to see what comes up. Yes, like a pretty even split kind of across the board, though we have kind of a plurality response here. If I didn't possess the skills I needed, and that makes sense. I guess that's kind of why we're gathered here tonight in the first place. Then, 24% each of the conditions at home or wasn't motivated. And we will get into kind of motivation a little bit today, but a little bit more in our next webinar. And then sometimes just easier to ignore a mistake. And I think if we're being honest, we've all ignored mistakes at one point or another. I'm sure we've all done it at least this week even. So let's go ahead and get into it a little bit. As I was saying to Claire, I'm actually going to run and coach 4th and 5th and 6th grade baseball team for my school right after this. So I guess I got baseball on the mind, but we've all experienced learning from a mistake, right? We've all been able to reflect on what went wrong, pocket those lessons, and move forward with a greater confidence. Or on the other hand, we've all made mistakes that we didn't learn from, right? In those instances, we made the mistake, we grew frustrated, and we took nothing away from the experience. So what actually accounts for that difference, right? Why is it that sometimes we learn and sometimes we stagnate or even regress? And said another way, consider that the baseball player who strikes out 200 times in a season is not destined to lead the league in home runs the following season, right? That player may have 200 opportunities to learn from their mistake, and yet that player may never learn to lay off that 2-2 slider. So let's try to answer as educators can do to better position our students to learn from their mistakes. Mistake literacy is a mindset consistent of a suite of dispositions and non-cognitive skills that work in tandem to optimize learning by building individuals' capacity and capability to recognize, react to, and repair their mistakes. Mistake literacy is about growing one's understanding of mistake making, creating the conditions for individuals to meaningfully engage with their mistakes, and equipping individuals with the competencies to learn from their mistakes. In short, mistake literacy aims to pave the way for future learning to occur by counteracting our tendency to ignore, deny, downplay, and outright disavow our mistakes. Right? Mistake literacy and introducing mistake literacy practices into your classroom isn't about granting your students a license to intentionally flunk your class one mistake at a time, right? Mistakes in the pursuit of learning occur because learners have pushed themselves to the edge of their knowledge or experience. Such mistakes expose gaps and raise questions and open the possibility for reflection and analysis. The particular value in mistake making lies in the ability to indicate where inadequacies in knowledge are present. Through this form of mistake making, learners develop a theory of what's correct, apply it, and revisit it as necessary. Of course, mistake learning is not strictly solvable by students, right? There are myriad factors at play, right? Schools are complex, human-centered organizations wherein learning is influenced by a dynamic constellation of environmental, personal, and behavioral factors. Therefore, to construct a transferable theory on how students can more consistently and embrace learning from their mistakes, the multi-layered and reciprocal nature of learning within schools must be accounted for. With this in mind, a comprehensive examination of how students learn from mistakes involves 4 distinct yet interrelated research streams: contextual conditions, intervening conditions, strategies, and consequences. The fishbone, or what's kind of commonly termed the Ishikawa diagram, articulates the cause and effect phenomenon of learning from mistakes in and focus exclusively on intervening conditions, which are the conditions that make it possible within a classroom context for students to experience the fun, frustration, and growth that's part and parcel to errorful learning. This stream of the larger research base examines those proximal influences that are within a teacher's control that can cultivate a learning environment wherein students possess the know-how, know why, and know when to learn from their mistakes. Now, teaching is a deeply complex and delicate craft that's contingent on the bidirectional relationship between myriad distal and proximal influences, right? In 1996, a study many of us are probably familiar with, Charlotte Danielson conducted a study out of which the framework for professional practice was born. Part of the point of her study was to illuminate the complexity of the profession. Of her many findings, one in particular stands out. Teachers make more than 3,000 non-trivial decisions every day. That means a classroom teacher is making a non-trivial decision roughly every 6.25 seconds. So consider the extraordinary subtlety and stress involved in making instant decisions about which student to call on, how to frame impromptu questions, or how to respond to an interruption, right? Given the immensity of the profession, the late Madeline Hunter analogizes teaching to surgery, right? As she says, you must be very skilled, very knowledgeable, and exquisitely well trained, because neither the teacher nor the surgeon can say, everybody sit still until I figure out what the heck we're going to do next. In part, the complexity of the profession stems from the fact that there's no one-size-fits-all model to teaching. There's no panacea, because the act of learning is as multifaceted as each individual learner. And yet teaching is not guesswork, right? There are interventions that teachers can incorporate into their routine educational practices to positively influence learning outcomes, right? According to John Hattie, 30% of the variance in student learning, the single most influential source of variance other than the students themselves. The central role that teachers play in the classroom is lent additional depth and texture when the morass of mistakes is made a feature rather than a bug of the learning environment. When students make a mistake, their response can range from surprise and bewilderment, right, to verbal expressions of frustration and anger. Which of these responses wins is the sum of multiple variables, one of which is the nature of the classroom climate. Teachers are the leader of the classroom, the one who has the most influence on the nature of being wrong climate that is established. Their actions and communication, right, tell students what the expectations are for mistake-related behavior and mistake-related thinking. And though this all may not really feel terribly commonplace in the United States, in places as culturally diverse as China and Japan, teachers have set the expectations that mistakes are integral to learning. For American students, errors tend to be interpreted as an indication of failure, whereas in China and Japan, for students, they are an index of what remains to be learned. In China and Japan, errors are seen as valuable sources of information that can be leveraged to make learning an increasingly personal and productive process. The research has found that in China and Japan, teachers use errors as a springboard to prompt discussions of and inquiry into challenging concepts. These open discussions of errors exist in stark contrast to how they're handled in the United States, where there exists that expectation of privacy. Studies of Chinese and Japanese students reveal that their teachers have much more open discussions about performance, marks, and mistakes. Scholars note that this seems to diminish the sense of shame that students feel when they make an error. This approach normalizes mistake making and decreases stigma as students begin to develop a clearer understanding that failure can beget success. Interestingly, the degree to which mistakes are integrated and accepted as a natural part of the learning process actually appears to be correlated as well to student achievement. Of the 77 countries that participated in the 2018 Performance for International Student Assessment, or better known as PISA, right? China placed first in all three categories: reading, mathematics, and science. Japan placed in the top 5 for mathematics and science, and the top 10 for reading. The United States, on the other hand, was comparatively less stellar. The data showed that, and I quote, performance in reading and math has been stagnant since 2000, with about a fifth of American 15-year-olds scoring so low that it appeared they had not mastered reading skills expected of a 10-year-old. Instructional practices in China and Japan suggest there exist operational and optimal methods that can be deployed. Evidenced by these 2018 results, actually leverage mistakes to maximize student achievement. So let's start tonight by examining teachers' orientation and disposition towards mistake making. So the literature on establishing an error-tolerant environment suggests that there are a number of distinct and interrelated qualities that emanate from and concern themselves with a teacher's outlook and attitude towards mistake making. Instructional strategies and programmatic changes can center errorful learning, but the efficacy of these shifts is mediated by how teachers respond to students when they make mistakes. A 2016 study found that individual teacher personality regulated students' responses to errors and was therefore important in setting the climate in learning. So how a student perceives the treatment of their mistakes in the classroom is called an error climate. A high error climate is characterized by a teacher's openness to different solutions to a problem, a willingness to share error knowledge, a comfort with facing misconceptions, continual efforts to help students correct errors by themselves. In particular, there are 4 teacher-specific qualities that can bring a high error climate to fruition: acknowledging students' mistakes, emphasizing the learning potential of mistakes, exhibiting patience when mistakes are made, and impeding negative reactions from classmates. In a high error climate, students are motivated to correct their errors and pursue an understanding why they made a mistake. In short, a high error climate sets the stage for mistakes to be seen as an integral element of the learning process. Actually, a high error climate accomplishes more than just adjusting perception. It's positively correlated to student attitude and achievement. A 2018 study conducted by the Peruvian Ministry of Education found that a positive error climate is able to explain, and this is of the variability of positive attitudes towards mathematics and 14.2% of the variability of achievement in mathematics, right? A high error climate is largely predicated on teachers intentionally calibrating their efforts and attitude to mitigate the negative associations that students may carry with them. Thing is, an aversion to mistakes is such an innate and automatic human response that leveraging mistakes as an instrument of learning cannot be wholly pathologized without consideration being given to offsetting those self-preserving brain patterns that hinder those adaptive responses to mistake making in the first place. Counterintuitive though it might be, this is where the role of humor comes into play. One distinguishing feature between a low error climate and a high error climate is whether a teacher responds to a student's mistake with acerbity or humor. According to the research, humor is a dispositional hinge point that can diffuse the self-admonishment that may naturally arise following a mistake. Humor can have a much more disarming, leveling, humbling, and most importantly, comforting effect than many might admit. Right? A professional playfulness can actually relax tensions and create a more forgiving atmosphere for content exploration. Moreover, responding to a mistake with a magnanimous chuckle or genial grin can elucidate the erroneous schematic that contributed to the mistake being made in the first place. If handled properly, humorous moments can offer insight into students' thinking and serve as a springboard for further inquiry. A bit of levity is a versatile tool to foster a culture of mistake learning in a classroom. Now, perhaps this is because mistake making and humor share a parallel structure. Right? Incongruity theory posits that comedy and errors arise from a mismatch, specifically a mismatch between expectation and actuality. So these situations begin with an attachment to a belief, which is then violated, producing surprise, confusion, and replacement beliefs. Classroom. So when teachers approach learning with a sense of humor rather than exasperation, it can translate into students doing the same. Of course, wrongness is not something that students experience in the moment. If it was, students would likely choose to, well, not make that mistake in the first place. So for this reason, we need to do a little bit more in our classrooms than just react with a well-meaning chuckle. We also need to be able to cultivate the space and the time for students to realize that a mistake has been made. The distance between an erroneous response and the conscious recognition of one's wrongness must be traversed by the learner, not the teacher. Teachers simply cannot do students' push-ups for them and expect their students to gain any muscle mass. Thus, a high error climate requires patience on the part of the teacher. The research shows that the development of the broad range of skills and competencies that undergird learning from mistakes cannot be developed merely by students being taught about them. There's simply no evidence to suggest that knowledge translates into action. As such, learning from mistakes can only be understood by being experienced. For teachers, this does not mean that we must all passively stand by. Rather, we have to exhibit practicality and patience as a matter of respect for students' autonomy in the learning process. In this way, teachers hold space for learning to occur by creating an atmosphere wherein students feel safe to reflect and rethink without interjection. Such patience has a catalytic effect on learning by empowering students to take ownership for their mistakes and reorient them to reconcile that dissonance between what they thought they knew what they actually know, and what's left to be known. Right? Such patience on the part of the teacher signifies a respect for the students, which in turn can actually strengthen the student-teacher relationship. Findings across myriad studies show that the student-teacher relationship is positively correlated to significant teachers who have close relationships with their students, respect them as learners and people, and demonstrate care and commitment to them. Again, circling back to John Hattie, right, he found that such respect for students is correlate to a 0.61 effect size, and that student-teacher relationship has an even larger effect size of a 0.72, which is actually the 11th highest influence on learning of the 252 variables that were studied. Right, the importance of these findings is especially pronounced when filtered through that lens of a high error climate. The qualities that define a strong student-teacher relationship are the building blocks of student success in a high error climate. Build-in relations with students encourages agency, efficacy, and allows the experiences of the child to be recognized in the classroom. Teachers who invest in their relationship with students are better equipped to recognize possible barriers to learning and seek ways to support students to overcome them. Such teachers are receptive to what the students need rather than attempting to dominate the situation. The ability to forge these positive, powerful connections is the linchpin for students to see mistakes as learning opportunities rather than negative indicators of performance. Right? We as teachers might not be in control of the mistakes that students make, but we are in control of our responses to those mistakes. A teacher's adaptive orientation to mistakes and the dispositional attributes they bring to their teaching can be the difference in students seeing mistakes as a cudgel that dissuades learning or a carrot that incentivizes the pursuit of future learning. At the same time, a classroom culture is comprised of more than a teacher's orientation and dispositions. So although teachers who possess these orientations and dispositions are ideal candidates to set the conditions for a mistake learning environment, a like suite of complementary instructional strategies need to be operationalized as well. So teachers must be keenly deploying optimal instructional strategies that match the learner with the learning. In a high error climate, this structure must account for, support, and seek to remedy the imperfections inherent to the learning process. So what instructional strategies are best suited to turn mistakes into salutary lessons? Error management training, or EMT, is one instructional strategy that has been found to destigmatize mistake making and reframe it as an avoidable aspect, or excuse me, as an unavoidable aspect of human behavior. It's a training method that involves the active exploration as well as explicit encouragement for learners to make errors and to learn from them. EMT impels students to make mistakes by fostering an environment in which they're provided only minimal instruction and are encouraged to learn through a process of active trial and error. The idea being that encouraging mistakes in a low stakes training setting can benefit learners by replacing the neurotic mindset generated by the conventional fear of mistakes with a factual investigation of their mistakes. This more clinical approach helps to foreground the positive consequences of mistake making by repositioning mistakes as something to be externalized and analyzed rather than something to be internalized and experienced. The reflection and rethinking that this externalization enables is positively correlated to adaptive transfer, which is the ability to apply learning to novel environments and problems. In other words, the learning that results from mistake making in an EMT climate can be transferred across a diverse set of high stakes circumstances. Classroom environments that employ EMT use formative learning exercises to encourage mistake making and are characterized by an open and positive error climate. Such an environment is cultivated by the teacher's frequent and proportional use of a Rolodex of adaptive responses to mistakes, including whole class instruction, error correction being returned to the student who made the mistake, teacher wait time, and an emphasis being placed on the learning potential of a mistake. In fact, the use of these techniques has been found to be a viable method to deepen critical and creative problem solving. EMT has been found to result in the production of higher quality, more original, and more elegant solutions to creative problems, and the thoughtful analysis of errors proved central to the eventual production of creative products. In all, EMT permits students the space to safely make and learn from their mistakes. But how can students learn from their mistakes outside of just a formative practice training scenario? Well, that's where productive failure comes in. Productive failure, otherwise known as PF, is an instructional strategy that combines open, student-guided inquiry with a subsequent instructional phase. In the initial inquiry phase, learners produce divergent and generative solutions that result in failure due to the fact that learners are commonly unable to discover or generate correct solutions to novel problems by themselves. The instructor then supports students to comprehend of and remedy their mistake making through a period of direct instruction. A period of inquiry followed by direct instruction has been found to strengthen the semantic network associated with the task, enhancing retention of the correct response. Findings show that PF results in students significantly outperforming their counterparts on procedural knowledge, conceptual understanding, and problem-solving competency. In fact, the instructional design of PF provides students the opportunity to think for themselves and activate their own understanding, which offsets the negative effects that direct instruction alone can have on student learning. In addition to the instructional design of PF, the tenor of the instructional phase has also been shown to impact the strategy's efficacy. Students who worked with teachers who practiced high press discourse achieved more than students who worked with low press teachers. Teachers' willingness to invite discussion about student errors and explicitly reference good mistakes. This approach, in turn, has been shown to cultivate a climate of mutual respect free from judgment. The research has also found that PF is most effectively implemented when the teacher uses the instructional phase to elaborate on erroneous solutions, as opposed to simply providing students with corrective feedback. Effective as PF is, its efficacy really is predicated on a premeditated instructional design. So what happens when students make a mistake outside of the tight structure of this instructional model? Well, this is where embedded and recursive feedback comes in, a model that accounts for the circuitous, nonlinear process of mistake learning. Of course, feedback comes in all shapes and sizes, not all of which have the desired impact on learning. In a high error climate, the research has found that feedback is most effective when it is candid and detailed, which is only possible when said feedback is mastery oriented as opposed to student oriented. Feedback must go beyond praising hard work to encourage the use of strategies in a purposeful and apt way. Such an approach to feedback can actually help to produce students who possess a growth mindset. In fact, similar research has found that student-oriented feedback results in a helpless pattern of responses to setbacks, wherein students are less able to correct errors on subsequent retests. It's for this reason that praise-based feedback must be avoided, as it can result in a fear of failure. However, when the right kind of feedback is combined with the right instructional practices, it can be a very powerful tool for learning. Finding that balance between the right type of feedback and right instructional model, it's a delicate one, and also is one that exists within a teacher's control. When feedback is leveraged as a formative instructional tool, it can quell confusion and cue next steps. In such an environment, students see feedback as a means of rethinking, reworking, and polishing. Students feel that they will be celebrated for going back to the drawing board, and it's our job to give them the opportunities to do so. By providing students with recursive, formative opportunities to seek and apply feedback, they begin to understand that mistakes do not define their journey, but are merely a signpost on a longer learning journey. Now, this suite of instructional strategies and dispositional learning jointly form a symbiotic ecosystem wherein teachers set the conditions for learners to develop the skills and competencies to disentangle mistake making from mistake learning by cultivating a high error climate. Under normal conditions, it's their customary response to deflect responsibility by playing that proverbial blame game. However, cultivating the sort of error climate we've discussed will produce learners who not only acknowledge their mistakes, but are accountable to them. In such an environment, learners view their mistakes with distance and benevolence, thus instilling a self-belief and inclination to speak up, ask for help, express minority views, and feel valued and be indifferent even when they're wrong. Now, I've been talking for quite a while and in no way adhered to the larger principles and practices of productive failure. So why don't we go ahead and move on to the part of this presentation where you get to chat in small groups in order to synthesize your learning from today. So we're going to go ahead and do breakouts on a Jamboard for about 10 or so minutes. And Claire, if we want to add a couple minutes, maybe we can do that as well. And in your breakouts, you're going to be answering collectively 3 questions. You're going to be answering the so what, the here's what, and the now what. The so what is, why is today's learning important? The here's what is, what are some things you've learned from this evening's presentation? And then third is the now what. It's, what are a few main takeaways that you want to share with the rest of the group? And this can be your own small breakout group, or you can think of that idea of group as being your colleagues at your school. For the waterfall. And so the way that the waterfall works is you're going to go ahead and you're going to start to type into the chat just one single point that has resonated with you, one single point that you want to share out with the rest of the group, but you're not going to hit that enter button just yet. In a couple of minutes, we're all going to hit the enter button at the exact same time. And we're going to have just this flurry of responses that we'll be able to track. And we might ask a couple of people to just unmute and maybe elaborate a little bit on their own thinking. But before we do that, we had this really a beautiful moment of mistake learning that actually happened in these last 5 or 10 minutes. So Claire, do you mind just unmuting and sharing a little bit about kind of our respective learning around Jamboard?
Yes, so I will share with you all that before I started this webinar, I was practicing opening and closing rooms and making sure all the technology would work. But it was all for naught because we realized that Jamboard had a little glitch we were not expecting. So apologies to any of you who had trouble accessing your particular Jamboard. We didn't realize that Jamboard had a limit on the number of people who could view it at once. But now we have learned that. And luckily, Zach was prepared with that second Jamboard. So we had some of you go over there, but apologies for that. But thank you for giving me this opportunity to learn in such a safe environment. So now next time something technical happens on a webinar, I will not live in fear of technical glitches because we were able to roll with it. Thank you all.
Well, and Claire, I mean, we can just go around, right? We're all educators here. Who here in the last 2 years has had an issue at some point unexpectedly with technology in the moment that they needed it most? I mean, literally every one of us, right? There's no sense in us pretending as though we are not making these mistakes. And in fact, we empower one another rather than trying to keep them privately. And I do want to just address one thing that came up in the chat. And then in a second, we're going to all hit the enter button at the same time, and we're going to see that flurry, but I'll let you know when. One thing that came up in the chat was the notion of the transferability between what we've been speaking about this evening from teachers to, or excuse me, from students to us as teachers. And I do think it's really important. These are some blogs that I've written about, and maybe, Claire, this will be the next webinar. In fact, education is such a deeply imperfect profession, right? There is no panacea, there is no silver bullet, there is no perfect pedagogy that is suddenly magically going to reach every kid. And I think it's really important for us to also be able to remember that we want to cultivate a climate professionally, especially for those of us on this call who are administrators. It's our job, first and foremost, to create a professional, collegial atmosphere where we are encouraging our teachers, our faculty to make mistakes, because their mistake making is indicative of their effort and their attempts to try to ensure that all students in their classroom are learning. And I think that as administrators, we need to kind of continuously be able to do a better job of that, because really, when a teacher makes a mistake, what we need to be able to do is give them a big smile, a big high five, and then ask them what they think the next steps are. I mean, really, that's most important. So with that, and on that note, let's go ahead and everybody press that enter key, and let's see what some of these main takeaways have been this evening. Whoa, okay. I've only been on the other side of a waterfall, so that was kind of a lot. So reflection, use humor. Yeah, yeah. I was saying this to Claire at the start, like as a principal, kids come into my office very sheepishly. And I always kind of remind them because, they'll begin to like self-flagellate and they'll begin to like admonish themselves. And I'm always like, let's pause. Let's chuckle a little bit at what you did. You wrote the word wiener, bathroom stall. That was a bad choice. Okay. But let's laugh about it a little bit. You're going to look back at this. It's going to be a great story. And now let's talk about next steps and logical consequences. No big deal. Absolutely. And we need to be able to have the same sort of grace and patience with ourselves, right? Yeah, yeah, absolutely, right. Reacting. Oh yeah, I mean, absolutely right. To build those student teacher relationships, to embrace a high volume error environment and look for opportunities, right? Mistakes do not define learning, right? It is just a springboard for further inquiry. And ultimately, it really is like it's a keyhole that actually gives us a glimpse into the learning machinations that are usually really sort of opaque and invisible to us. So it's really helpful to be able to actually take that mistake and then ask ourselves, okay, what does that indicate about this child's learning, right? Maybe even how they learn. I know that whenever I've learned languages, I lived in China for a little while, Morocco for a little while. Whenever I sought to learn a language, I always use the mistakes in trying to superimpose and transpose, American and English grammar on top of, let's say, a Chinese grammatical structure, and that always really helped me. I love that notion of being able to be daring and bold as our privilege allows. We didn't get into it, but if you remember the fishbone, one of the where it starts in terms of cause and effect is culture. And we'll definitely begin to unpack that a little bit more in future blog posts. There are just so many wonderful responses in here, but why don't we go ahead just based on the time and begin to wrap things up. So if you would like to learn more, or you'd like to bring this work, to your schools, um, and just maybe learn some practical everyday tools that you can add to your toolkit, you can always reach out to me, or you can attend our next presentation when we'll be sharing some more specific and actionable strategies that you can use in your classroom to bring the work of mistake literacy to life. And I want to think about doing a session for administrators on creating a learning culture amongst the faculty and in their schools as well. But in the meantime, and I did see a couple of people write this in the Jamboard, if you're not sure where to start, Claire's going to share a mistake literacy professional learning playlist with you all. This playlist is a live, ever-growing, ever-evolving document that's going to serve as your one-stop shop for the most current research about learning from mistakes, including the research base that I spoke about, and a bunch of resources on productive failure and error management training, if you're curious. So I hope that you enjoy perusing it as much as I've enjoyed curating it. And this document is one that I revisit every week and seek to update about every week. So constantly kind of circle back to it or bookmark it, and you'll find new resources on it. And with that, thank you so much for attending. And I look forward to connecting with you again soon. Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Zach. This is really great. And thank you again for letting me have my learning from mistake moment here. And Lisa's going to pop in the chat a certificate survey. So you can get 1 hour of professional learning credit certified for having attended this webinar. So Lisa's popped that in the chat there. And you'll also, in the follow-up email, you get a link to the recording, a link to that playlist that Zach mentioned, and then again, the certificate survey, so in case you want that verification. But thank you all again for giving us your time tonight, and thank you, Zach. This was great.
Absolutely.
Everyone, have a great evening.
So why don't we go ahead